Amen. Good morning, everyone. I hope you're doing well today. So wonderful to see Meryl and her family here. I know that many of us are aware, but for those of us that aren't aware, a little over a week ago, Meryl lost her mother. And so a few days ago, we held the funeral service here at the church. And so just wanted to let you know that we love you, that you have a church family and community of believers that have been holding you in their heart, who are praying for you, and that are there for you. And it's really, really wonderful to see you here this morning. We love you. All right. I want you to imagine with me for a moment. Imagine that the year is 6 BC, and you are an average Joe living in what we now consider to be the ancient Roman Empire. What do you reckon the biggest problem in the world is at this stage? Is it poverty? Or is it perhaps slavery? Maybe you might want to say the biggest problem is the heavy yoke of Roman oppression. Could it be perhaps that the biggest problem is the fact that people die from everyday infections that we consider to basically be minor inconveniences because of the advent of antibiotics? I can imagine one of the teenagers easily saying, the biggest problem is the fact that there's no Wi-Fi. To be honest, I kind of see where they're coming from. Now, let's fast forward 2,000 years into the future, all right, to today, the 29th of December, 2024. What do you reckon the biggest problem, the greatest threat to humanity is today? Is it global warming? Or perhaps is it the danger posed by religious extremist groups like ISIS or Boko Haram? Or maybe you might want to say that the greatest issue facing us today, depending on your political affiliation, is the rise or fall of any particular figure or particular political figure or political party. Or maybe you might point to the current mental health crisis that is so evident in the rise of anxiety, stress, and depression. Or maybe you might want to point to any of the number of wars that are currently going on and say, Aki, I reckon that's the biggest problem currently facing humanity. What is it? You see, I don't want to undermine or speak lightly of any of the things you might have been thinking of, but from God's perspective, the biggest problem that is facing humanity is not any of those things. It's not global warming. It's not ISIS. It's not, and has never been, the oppression of the Roman Empire. The biggest issue that is facing humanity, at least from God's perspective, is darkness. Spiritual darkness, for it is the root of every other single thing that ills humanity. And what's more, spiritual darkness is the only problem that has plagued each and every single human being, all the way from Adam to every single baby being born right now. It's a problem that everyone has faced, without exception. The same is not true of slavery. The same cannot be said of the Roman Empire. The same can't even be said of ISIS or even poverty. So, as we approach our text for today, I want us to consider this great problem of spiritual darkness and God's cure for it, particularly in the context of the coming of Jesus and his ministry in Galilee. I want us to also look at some of the implications and application that it has for us today, because on a micro level, super zoomed in, our text is going to talk about what the coming of Jesus meant for a small region called Galilee. And yet, on a macro level, when you zoom out a bit, it actually shows what the coming of Jesus meant for the whole world, stretching even to us today. So I want you to just keep that at the back of your mind, okay? Jesus and his ministry in Galilee as a microcosm of Jesus and his ministry in the world, all right? And I'll prove the validity of that as we make our way through the text. And we're going to take our reading from Matthew chapter 4, verses 12 to 16. Matthew chapter 4, from verses 12 to 16, and we're specifically going to zero in on verse 16. All right. Reads as follows. When Jesus heard that John had been put in prison, he withdrew to Galilee. Leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum, which is by the lake in the area of Zebulun and Naphtali, to fulfill what was said through the prophet Isaiah. Land of Zebulun and land of Naphtali, the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people living in darkness have seen a great light. And on those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. Darkness and light. Darkness and light. Let's first consider darkness, all right? So, most of us will know the famous messianic prophecy by Isaiah. You know, for unto us a child is born, and unto us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulder. He shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, and so on and so forth. Well, Matthew here quotes from the same prophetic word, that very same prophetic word that Isaiah gives. But he starts off a little bit earlier from where the prophecy began. And just for a bit of context, Isaiah gives this prophetic word at a time when gross darkness had consumed the entire nation of Israel. They were actually in a period of great spiritual decay, with God's very people employing the services of mediums and spiritists to hear from the dead, a sin that greatly angered God. And so, because of this, idolatry and so many other sins that we really don't have the time to get into today, judgment will befall the nation. And yet, Isaiah says that a light will come. Amidst this backdrop of darkness and rebellion against God, the Holy Spirit shows Isaiah a time, 700 to 800 years in the future, where things would be just as bad, if not worse. And yet, out of that darkness, God promises to bring light. That even though weeping will endure for a very long night, God will bring joy in the morning. And this is the context in which Matthew says that the words of Isaiah find fulfillment. This is how it played out. So, by the time Jesus comes onto the scene, as prophesied, things were bad. Things were bad. Firstly, things were bad politically. You see, the Roman Empire had conquered most of the known world. And the empire, well, it really wasn't afraid to throw its weight around and make sure that the conquered masses really knew their place. And as a result of this political oppression, there had been a number of failed insurrection attempts by Jewish extremist groups like the Zealots. In addition to the political darkness, the world that Jesus came into was also riddled with economic darkness. Economic darkness, because not only did Rome rule with an iron fist, but they also taxed the people heavily. They taxed the people heavily. the Roman Empire was constantly growing. And so by the time Jesus comes onto the scene, they would have conquered land all the way from what we call modern day England through to North Africa and even reaching to parts of India. So the empire was growing. And with that growth, there came a lot of costs. And what do governments do when they become large and the costs become great? They put that burden on the citizenry. And so it proved in Jesus' day that the people were being taxed heavily. But not only that, but because of the fact that the empire was so big, it was practically impossible for the collection and gathering of these taxes to be done in a sort of centralized kind of way. And so Rome actually sold these tax franchises, basically meaning they sold the right to collect taxes. Now, what's so bad about that, you might ask? Well, the issue with this is it meant that whoever bought a tax franchise for a particular reason, they could more or less charge whatever they wanted, provided they gave a certain minimum to Rome. And so this actually resulted in the sort of situation where people weren't really too sure what exactly the tax rate was, because it differed from place to place depending on how corrupt your taxman was. And of course, we know the taxmen, they're not corrupt. So far, we've spoken about extremist terrorist groups, i.e. the zealots, unfair taxation, and simmering political tension. If you think about it, this doesn't just describe the world that Jesus came into. In a lot of ways, this describes our world today. Actually, it reminds me of the words of the teacher in Ecclesiastes. There is nothing new under the sun. Whatever has been will be, and whatever has been done will be done again. But the similarities, they don't end there. Because not only was there political and economic darkness, but there was also moral darkness. See, the Greco-Roman world operated in a sort of class system, and very, very high up in the food chain were free-born Roman citizens, especially male free-born Roman citizens. And so if you weren't a Roman citizen, well, life could be difficult, to put it lightly. For example, if you were a slave, a prostitute, or a foreigner, you could potentially be raped without the possibility of turning to the law or legal system for assistance. Now, depending on how cynical you are, I know you might say, well, Aki, doesn't sound much different from what we have today. To which I'd respond, well, at least we have the facade of a constitution that enshrines the equality of all people before the law. The Romans, they didn't even bother. Some animals just were outright more equal than others in that society. And it was in the midst of this darkness that light would emerge. Having said that, however, the most pervasive form of darkness was not the economic darkness. Neither was it the moral decay that had ravaged society. The most pervasive form of darkness, instead, was the spiritual darkness that had engulfed the entire world, but especially God's people, Israel. And this was the case primarily for two reasons. First was the fact that Israel had been waiting for the long-promised Messiah. And I mean, sure, they were expecting this Messiah to be able to deal with the economic and political turmoil, to be able to overthrow the Roman government, but in a real sense, they were also expecting a spiritual leader, someone like Moses, someone who could be able to lead the nation in spiritual renewal and reform. That's essentially the reason why when Jesus' cousin John, the baptizer, soon after he began his ministry, one of the first questions people asked him was, "Are you the promised one?" They were eagerly, perhaps even desperately, anticipating the Messiah's arrival. And they'd been waiting for him for a long, long time, seemingly to no avail. And you know that hope deferred can make the heart sick. And so it proved with the Jews. The other cause for this spiritual darkness was the fact that the Jews were in a strange period of their history known as the 400 silent years. 400 silent years. It was strange because for much of their history, the Jews, they'd become accustomed to hearing from God because God would talk to them. He talked to them as the nation approached pivotal junctures. He talked to them during the many, many, many times when they veered off track. God would speak into the issues that were confronting their nation. Of course, God did this through special individuals that he chose called the prophets, which includes people like Elijah and Jeremiah and so many others. When you look at this, is it any wonder that Isaiah prophetically describes them as people living in darkness? Can you imagine the sense of abandonment and helplessness that they would have felt at this apparent absence of their God? I don't know if you've ever experienced that. Feeling as though God has abandoned you. Feeling as though God does not care to so much as even listen to your prayers. That's how the Jews felt. That's the state that their nation was in. And it was in this period of silence that heaven whispered out. It was in this moment of great spiritual darkness that the light of God pierced into their night. Let's talk about the light. Again, Matthew is quoting Isaiah when he puts it this way: "The people living in darkness have seen a great light. And on those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned." But what exactly was that light? Well, maybe it'll be helpful to, before we define exactly what that light was, to first of all say what it wasn't. The light that came down from heaven was not a list of principles to be obeyed. Neither was it a new sort of philosophy that the people were supposed to adhere to. Philosophy, the Greeks had been there, done that. That's not what it was. But neither was the light that God sent down a sort of political enlightenment that would fix the broken political system that God's own people were suffering under. Neither was this light some sort of novel economic theory. It wasn't communism. Thank God it wasn't communism. The light that God sent when he saw his people in darkness. His concern was so great and his love so deep that he had to send the ultimate solution. Not some plaster, a Band-Aid, which is what all those other things would have been. In fact, God didn't send anyone, but rather he came down, because the light was God himself coming down in the person of Christ. That's why Jesus said in John chapter 8, "I am the light of the world." That's why Matthew here doesn't merely speak of a light, but rather he speaks of a great light. After having heard nothing from God for 400 years, God finally spoke. But not like they'd heard, because, like I said earlier, in the past, God had spoken to the Jews' ancestors at various times in many different ways by the prophets, but this time, God spoke by his very Son. So the light was also the restored voice of God to them, and it was both clearer and louder than anything they had ever known. This light revealed to the people in Galilee, shackled by darkness, spoke. It spoke when the royal official pleaded for his dying son to be healed. This light spoke in Capernaum of Galilee as people brought by the multitudes, the sick, the suffering, the demon-possessed. This light spoke with absolute authority as the scribes and Pharisees posed great and confounding questions. He spoke not only in word, but in action, as he healed, delivered, and set free all who were brought to him. He spoke clearly and definitively, answering every question we've ever had about God's true nature and character. Having said that, what does this light do? What does this light accomplish? From our text, I want us to very quickly consider two things that Jesus Christ, the light, accomplishes. First, and most obviously, his light, well, it deals with the problem of darkness. Deals with the problem of darkness. Remember, we spoke a bit earlier about how Jesus said, I am the light of the world. Well, in that very same verse, he continues and he says, whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will instead have the light of life. What else does this light do? Well, it is greater than and therefore able to overcome death. Remember, Matthew writes that on those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. Which is to say that Isaiah's prophecy addressed a people who lived haunted by the looming figure of death and danger. And if you think about it, even today, for so many in our city, dare I say, the overwhelming majority, people in our city, people in our neighborhoods, people in our complexes, they, just like the people that Matthew describes here, are living in the realm of spiritual death, under the overwhelming influence of the one who is called the Prince of Darkness. To be in something's shadow means to be under its influence, to be drenched in the stench of its imminence, to continually live and abide under the shade of its relentless and cruel shade. That's how Matthew describes the state of the people that Jesus came to. Spiritual death and all that accompanies a life that is separate from the light of Jesus Christ. In contrast to this state, of course, in Jesus Christ we have life. In him there is life, and that life is a light for all mankind. That light shines in the darkness, and to this very day the darkness has not been able to overcome it. Having spoken about that Jesus Christ himself, who is able to rescue, Jesus Christ himself is the light. He is the light that is able to rescue those who are in darkness. He is the light that is able to give life to those who are afflicted by the ravages of spiritual death. But who are the intended recipients of this great light? To whom does this great light apply? Well, we know for a fact that Jesus was the Messiah promised and prophesied to the Jews. And so there's no doubt that this light is certainly meant for them. But our verse also talks about the Gentiles. And so that includes all the rest of us, right? English Gentile, Afrikaans Gentile, Zulu Gentile, Tsonga Gentile. It includes all of us. And that's good news, isn't it? I said, isn't it? As I get ready to close, I began today by highlighting spiritual darkness as being the greatest problem facing humanity. And I argued that it's the only issue that God saw, this utter lostness in spiritual darkness and our inability to get ourselves out of it through any effort of our own. It's the one issue that so bothered our Creator that He came down and became the light we so desperately needed. But someone might say, if Christ truly dealt with this problem, why then is it still a reality? Why do people still find themselves in great darkness if Christ is the light, as you are saying, and has resolved this problem? My answer to that, actually God's answer to that, are the words of Jesus in John chapter 3, when He says, "This is the verdict. Light has come into the world. But the people loved darkness instead of light. And they loved darkness because their deeds were evil." That is the verdict. Light came. Light came into the world, and yet people loved darkness. And they loved the darkness, Jesus says, because their deeds were evil. All that to say that although it might be the case that darkness still reigns over people, it doesn't have to be. If you are not walking in the light and are living a life that is apart from the lordship of Jesus and the life that is to be found in Him, it does not need to remain that way. Light has come, and that light came just for you. I know I said a little bit earlier that the good news about the arrival of this light is meant for the Jews and Gentiles, which technically includes everyone. It covers everyone. But allow me to add a third kind of category, a third kind of person to whom the promise, the good news of the coming of this light applies. See, according to our text, this light came for anyone, and I mean anyone, who finds themselves in darkness. And if you aren't a believer, well, then you're in the greatest form of darkness. And my counsel to you is, don't love the darkness. Why would you? Light has come. And for the Christian, if there is indeed anything holding you back, anything hindering you in your walk with Jesus, then for you too, light has come. If there is any darkness of guilt, of shame, of addiction, the light does not push you away. Instead, He calls you to Himself. Brothers and sisters, light has come. The only question is, what will be the verdict over your life? Let's pray.